I'd like to introduce Lierre. She's been a radical feminist since her mother gave her a copy of Mary Daly's Gynecology for her 16th birthday. It's pretty cool. She's the author of 3 novels as well as 2 works of non-fiction which are for sale at the back, on the back table. And she lives in Northern California.
That's right. All right, thank you.
Well, right now scientists are debating whether a quarter, a third, or fully half of all mammals will be extinct by the year 2050. In fact, some of them are debating whether there will be life at all on this planet by the end of this century. What is never up for debate, and I mean not ever, is a culture that devours with an entitlement so profound it is turning the planet to dust. That dust is not hyperbole. The dust storms in China are so bad they have...
Laura, can you speak slower?
So sorry. This is going to be very hard. I'm from the East Coast. This is how I talk. And I don't even drink coffee.
This is how I listen.
I understand. Okay, well, the dust is not hyperbole. Here's China. Here's the dust. Here it is leaving the coast into the Pacific. And here it is landing in Colorado. My planet is being murdered. And I've got 3 questions. What is that murder made of? Who's in charge? How do we stop them? None of that is cognitively challenging. Emotionally daunting? Maybe. Ideologically tough? Okay. But intellectually, this is a no-brainer. There are 3 overlapping systems that have created this feeding frenzy of destruction. Now, the first is called civilization. And that just means people living in cities. But what that actually means is it's people living in densities that are too big for the land to support. So that means that the food, the water, the energy, they all have to come from somewhere else. From that point forward, it doesn't matter what lovely, beautiful, non-violent values people might hold in their hearts. That society is dependent on imperialism and genocide because no one willingly gives up their land, their water, their trees. But since the city has used up its own, it has to go out and get them from somewhere else. And that's essentially the last 10,000 years in 2 sentences. Of course, you know, history is written by the victors, so we all think of civilization like this, most advanced stage, blah, blah. What it really should say, the most destructive form of human social development and organization. Okay, we're going to back up 4 million years. We'll take this very quickly. Australopithecine arrives on the plains of Africa, evolves there. 2.3 million years ago, the genus Homo evolves out of the Australos, and that's us, that's our genus. Homo habilis uses stone tools and has a brain about the size of a chimpanzee. Over the next 1 million years, so it's a long time in the making, habilis undergoes a process that's called encephalization. So the cranial capacity doubles. And then Homo erectus emerges from that. And Homo erectus leaves Africa about 1.5 million years ago. They're the first to use fire and more complex tools. So this big brains start to come in handy. Homo sapiens evolved from that about 400,000 years ago. And by 200,000 years ago, you've got humans identical to all of us. You could not tell the difference if you just gave them my haircut. We would look the same. By 100,000 yeurs ago, we're doing something really interesting. We start burying our dead. And we're doing it ritualistically. So the skeletons are positioned usually in this, they call it the sleeping position. They're painted with ochre. There are grave goods, so objects put in the graves. We don't know what it means, but they start doing these things. This is the oldest human burial ever found. It's in a place called, and I'm probably murdering this, Kafsa, which is in modern-day Israel. There were 15 skeletons found at this gravesite. This is a woman and a child. So what happens next is called by some the Great Leap Forward. Some people call it the creative explosion. But by 50,000 years ago, you've got modern human culture. So people are making clothes from hides. They're making jewelry. We've got musical instruments. There's way more sophisticated hunting techniques. There's definitely barter going on. And there's art. So what are we painting? We're painting an awful lot of animals. Lascaux is probably the most famous Paleolithic site. When Pablo Picasso went to see Lascaux when it was still open to the public, and when he emerged from the cave, what he said was, "We have invented nothing." Meaning, you know, this huge sweep, 3,000 years of Western art, blah, blah. Of course, you always think you're on the peak of the wave. And he looked around and he's like, "We didn't invent this. This has been around forever." So here's Mariwa. Oh, this is also Lascaux. Mariwa. These are just beautiful paintings. This one I find intriguing. What are they doing? The 2 people on the right, I think, are women, and the 2 on the left, I think, are men. But I think this is some sort of religious ritual. I mean, we will never know, but I just think it's just intriguing. And the one animal is faced toward them. Okay, and our second most common art project. This is the so-called Venus of Hohenfels. Now, a lot of us object to this Venus terminology, right? Venus is the goddess of love, of beauty, so she's, you know, the object for the male gaze. This is really trivializing. When these pictures of this sculpture were published in the journal Nature, it ran with the caption, Paleolithic pinup. Yeah, it gets better. Then Huffington Post picked it up. Prehistoric porn. The only good thing is if you read the comments, women are furious. So for once, the comments are worth reading. Anyway, yeah, they can't even let us escape, you know, intellectually from their porn-sick epistemology. This is the oldest figurative sculpture ever found. She's about 40,000 years old. She's carved from the tusk of a woolly mammoth, and it probably took hundreds of hours to carve this little figurine. Probably worn as a necklace. You can see the hole at the top as a pendant around the neck. She was found in a cave in southern Germany, and the oldest musical instrument ever found was also found next to her, and it was a flute carved from a vulture bone. And then, as usual, in the cave, there's the remains of reindeer and cave bear and ibex and all the creatures that were providing nourishment. Here's another famous, the goddess of LaSalle. This may be the very first human calendar, in fact, if you count the little marks on the horn. And here she's got her hand over her womb. So some people think this is probably counting the number of menstrual cycles in a year. We don't know, but this is certainly a good guess. And I'll give you one hint. The men didn't figure this out. It's usually the women archaeologists who get this. Or they'll find these little bones that have little marks on them. And, you know, it'll be like 30 days, or 30 little marks, the next one has 31, the next one has 30, and the men are like, oh, we think it's a lunar cycle. And women are like, oh, a 31-day lunar cycle? We know what this is. They're counting their menstrual cycles. So this is the beginning of the counting of calendars, of counting time. Okay, so the first art we ever made was the Megafauna and the Megafemales, because that was who gave us life. And I think this is the beginning of religion. There's a sacredness of awe and thanksgiving that I think is built into us, body and brain. So these images, this consciousness, it's so primary that even after the transition to the Neolithic and well into patriarchy, people can't give up these images. They keep making them. So Neo just means new. So Neolithic is anything after agriculture, and Paleolithic is the time before agriculture. So these are some Neolithic images now from what came after the Paleolithic time. So these are agricultural societies. This is from Çatalhöyük, which is one of the oldest agricultural settlements that's ever been excavated. They've been digging this up since the 60s. They found so much stuff. And 95% of the figurines are animals, and 5% are women, or human females. So it's the same template. And here she is. You know, still the Megafauna and the Megafemales. So fast forward a few thousand years, now we're into Egypt, so well into patriarchy, militarism, and here she is again, Hathor, the goddess Hathor. Again, the Megafauna, the Megafemales. I'm just following this culture as it, you know, exploits its way across the Mediterranean. Now we're into ancient Greece. Her name is Artemis, but it's still the Megafauna and the Megafemales. Another Artemis. A couple thousand years more, now it's Diana, the Roman Diana, but it's still this giant woman with the big animals. And finally, you know, you get into Christianity, and you know, this is the basic image of Western art. It's the Nativity. And it's this larger-than-life woman. You can still see the Megafauna in the picture. And it's this dark cave of a stable. Here's another one. You can more easily find images of her with no reference to Joseph than you can find images without the animals. This is the story of the Megafauna and the Megafemales. Here she is again. Do you see Joseph anywhere? No, but you see those horned animals in the back. Not even pretending this is a stable, this is a cave. So we have indeed invented nothing. And for all that time, for 2.5 million years, our time on this planet, we were not monsters and destroyers, okay? We were participants in this. Lauren Cordain, who's an expert in Paleolithic nutrition, he uses this image of a football field. So all of our time on Earth is everything up to that last half yard. That's the Paleolithic period. That very last half yard, that's when agriculture begins. And in fact, the last 1/5 of an inch is the industrial era, including industrial food and industrial modern agriculture. So half a yard is where the disaster begins. In 7 places around the globe, people start to completely change their way of life to this activity called agriculture. So you have to understand what agriculture is. You take a piece of land, you clear every living thing off it, and I mean down to the bacteria, and then you plant it to human use. in very brute terms. That's what agriculture is. That's not agriculture on a bad day. That's what agriculture is. It's biotic cleansing. So the first problem, it lets the human population grow to some pretty big numbers. Instead of sharing that land with millions of other creatures who do need a home, you're just growing humans on it. So it's a nice way to say mass extinction. The next problem is that we're destroying the topsoil. And soil is the basis of life, or land life anyway. We owe our entire existence to 6 inches of soil and the fact that it rains. So except for the last 46 remaining tribes of hunter-gatherers, the human race has now made itself dependent on a way of life that is killing the planet. Now this is not a plan with a future. It's drawdown, and it's drawdown in a big way. And what you're drawing down is fossil soil. To give you a number, 1 season of planting your basic row crop, so corn or wheat or soy, you can blow through 2,000 years of topsoil in 1 season. There were farms on the first day of the Dust Bowl in South Dakota where they lost all their soil in 1 day. So this is drawdown just on any huge measure. Agriculture is also drawdown of fossil water at this point. I mean, they have to use oil pumping equipment to get the water out now. Which means that the water table is well beyond the depth that normal people can get to it, and this is why people are abandoning their farms in India and Pakistan and places all around the world. There simply is no more water. They can't reach it anymore. It's drawdown of species, certainly, and it's drawdown of entire ecosystems at the end of the day. This is Iraq, one of the places that agriculture first began. This was a cedar forest so thick that sunlight never touched the ground, and this is what it looks like now. You'd be out of your mind to call this place the Fertile Crescent. Iran, 94% of it's degraded. That's a dust storm in the back. That's not a mountain. Okay, you get that that's the soil blowing away. Pakistan, 1/3 is at risk for desertification. 150 years ago, that was a teak forest. When you destroy soil, you're destroying the basis of life. And Jared Diamond, who won a Pulitzer Prize for Guns, Germs, and Steel, he said that agriculture is the biggest mistake the human race has ever made. Toby Hemingway calls sustainable agriculture an oxymoron, and Richard Manning uses exactly the same sentence. Manning is worth quoting. No biologist, or anyone else for that matter, could design a system of regulations that would make agriculture sustainable. Sustainable agriculture is an oxymoron. It mostly relies on an unnatural system of annual grasses grown in a monoculture, a system that nature does not sustain or even recognize as a natural system. We sustain it with plows, petrochemicals, fences, and subsidies because there is no other way to sustain it. What you are looking at in this picture is a clear cut of the grassed forest. Okay, this was a prairie, it is now a monoculture. All right, well, agriculture is the most destructive thing people have done to the planet. I'm going to say that again. Agriculture is the single most destructive human activity. Well, remember what agriculture is. You pull down the forest, you rip up the prairie, you drain the wetlands. And what should be habitat for millions of creatures doing the basic work of life, it turns into salt and dust. Agriculture is carnivorous. What it eats is entire ecosystems, and that's what it's done around the globe. So to state the obvious, no culture that is destroying the basis of life can be called sustainable. Really, it can only be called insane. So agriculture is run through every continent. Well, all of them except Antarctica, but that's okay. We're going to get that one with global warming. It's also the beginning of militarism, and it's the beginning of slavery. So in the 7 centers where agriculture began, you have this way of life called civilization. So people living in settlements big enough that they require the importation of resources. So the pattern of civilization is the same. It's a bloated power center, and then you have conquered colonies all around it. And the center extracts what it wants and brings it back to the power center. So, can you find the psychopath in this picture? Agricultural societies end up militarized, and they always do, for 3 reasons. The first one is that agriculture produces a surplus, it also requires a surplus. But if it can be stored, it can be stolen, and someone has to guard it, and that would be soldiers. Number 2 is imperialism. Since agriculture is inherently destructive, they eventually have to go out and get more land, more topsoil, more water, more trees. There's an entire class of people whose job is simply war, to go out and get the stuff that the power center needs. Agriculture makes that possible. It also makes it inevitable. And number 3 is slavery. Some of those resources would be other human beings. Agriculture is backbreaking labor. For anyone to have leisure time, you need slaves. We've lost the cultural memory of this because we've been using machines now for about 150 years to do that work. By the year 1800, that's the beginning of the fossil fuel age, by 1800, fully 3/4 of the people alive on the planet were living in some form of slavery, indenture, or serfdom. 3/4. When the fossil fuel starts to run out, we're going to remember exactly how much work is involved in this. So here's a female slave from Egypt. They would have spent probably 12, 14 hours a day in this position grinding grain. And the evidence in their skeletons tell a very grim story of the grinding down that took place in their spines and their hips and their knees from doing this 12 hours a day. This is the iconic image that the abolition movement used, how to fit as many human beings as possible into the hull of a ship. And it's actually an interesting story. A slaver drew this picture to encourage other slavers to make more money, and the abolition people got a hold of it, and it was so self-evidently horrifying that they printed thousands of these, and if you were an abolitionist, your job was to hang these everywhere. The idea being that people would just they would join because this was so horrendous. And the thing is, to me, that's just personally interesting is that I remember the first time I ever saw this picture. I was 12 years old, and it had that effect on me. It was horrendous. Okay, so here's why the agriculturists always win. If you're willing to destroy your forest, you will win against the people who are living with theirs. Because it takes 600 trees to make one of these ships. You will then have to conquer the people living with their forest to take their trees, having used all of yours. And honestly, that's the last 10,000 years in a paragraph. This is the St Croix River. The blue part is the part that goes through a more or less intact ecosystem. The brown, that's the river, and it's brown because of the soil. That goes through the agricultural areas. So, okay, well, there aren't any new continents. Atlantis is not waiting to be discovered outside of our past life regressions. By the year 1950, the planet was pretty well out of topsoil, and what should have happened then was the collapse that is always a part of civilizations. Civilizations last as long as their soil, which is usually between 800 and 1500 years, and then the pattern starts over somewhere else. What happened instead was the Green Revolution, and that was based on fossil fuel. So at this point, if you're eating agricultural foods, it's oil in the stock. It takes 9 calories of energy to make 1 calorie of food. Completely insane system. It takes the equivalent of 3 to 4 tons of TNT per acre for a modern American farm. Iowa alone uses the energy equivalent of 4,000 Nagasaki bombs every year. When I talk about this as a war against the planet, it is not a metaphor. I mean it literally. The very creation myth of Western civilization tells men to dominate, to conquer, to go forth and multiply. No hunter-gatherer is told by God to willfully overshoot her land's carrying capacity. And I gotta say, no rational person would listen to such a God, but that's what we're up against. It's been a disaster for the planet, it's been a disaster for human health, it's been a disaster in terms of mass extinction. We have this concept, the diseases of civilization. So the first thing that happens when people take up agriculture, their teeth fall out and their bones start falling apart. They shrink 6 inches pretty much overnight. The 2 diseases on the bottom are caused by iron deficiency anemia. You do not see these things in hunter-gatherers. You see them all the time in agriculturalists. And that's why an archaeologist can look at a bone and tell you literally in 2 seconds whether the agriculturalists or not. Okay, so it's piss-poor nutrition, it's backbreaking labor, it's drawdown of entire continents, the ecological footprint is gigantic, mass extinction, ever-increasing population, continuous drawdown. The real problem is not to explain why some people were slow to adopt agriculture, but why anybody took it up at all, when it is so obviously beastly. We don't actually know. None of the explanations actually match the facts. The only explanation that makes even halfway sense to me is the fact that these foods are addictive. And I've seen this in my own life. I know people who've been able to give up cigarettes, cannot give up wheat. Not for anything. Their health is at risk, they still can't do it. We don't know. That may be the explanation that actually matches the facts. So, all right, well, that was civilization. On to capitalism. Second system that's destroying the planet, capitalism. Ultimately, it's sort of like civilization on steroids. Capitalism takes living creatures in their homes, it turns them into private property, then converts them to dead commodities, and accumulates those commodities into wealth. It's a pyramid scheme of death. The Occupy movement has staked its claim on being the 99%. I think that's actually obvious, right? Capitalism is the 1% stealing from the 99%. The only thing we should add to that is that 98% of the old growth forests are gone, and 99% of the world's prairies are gone. And that means 99% of the pasque flowers, and 99% of the bison, and 99% of the prairie dogs, they're gone. So this is a pyramid scheme of death. And the point to me is not to redistribute the wealth, it's to stop the death while there is still something left alive. Now, I love this poster. This is the IWW. And we rule you, we fool you, we shoot at you. I just think this is perfect. The only part missing is that the very bottom layer really should be the women. The women and the girls. So I think if a feminist drew it, it might look like this. I've not been able to find anybody to translate this yet. I'm not even sure we need a translation to get the general idea. You got the big guy sitting on the little guy, and they're both sitting on the woman, who's doing the basic sustenance work to keep them all alive. And on that note, I just want to recognize the women who've been working in the kitchen and how hard they've been working. But we know what this picture means because we also know that poverty has a woman's face. Okay, so I'm going to assume we basically get that capitalism is a problem in this room, which is a nice thing to be able to assume, I have to say. But just briefly, here's why. The goal of capitalism is the creation of wealth. It's not to provide for human needs. So what that means is, well, first of all, it's brand new. I mean, people have only been doing capitalism for maybe 300 years. In fact, there's some economic historians who put the exact year at 1834. Because until that point, land and labor are not fully commodified. But after 1834, they absolutely are. What drives a capitalist economy is a ceaseless quest for more wealth, which means for more investment opportunities. So the wealthy people have capital. They want to invest it in something that will make more profit for them. The only way they're going to do that is if there is an ever-increasing number of investment opportunities. What that means is people have to consume more. Every year they have to consume more so that there are more investment opportunities for the wealthy. In fact, if the economy does not grow by about 3% a year, it crashes. Another way to say that is that all the consumption happening on the planet has to double every 20 years. Every 20 years. Last time I looked, the planet had exactly 197 million square miles and not 1 inch more. Okay? You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. So the system is insane, and it's consuming the planet to death. Okay, a few other little problems. So the profit motive is really bad at distributing goods and investments according to human need. So there's no public discussion of what is good or necessary or reasonable. Whatever people with money want, that's where the investments are made. So the rich are making decisions for all of us about things like food and housing and healthcare, and the rest of us have no say. Oh, I forgot, we're supposed to vote with our dollars. Right. Okay, I'm not that stupid. And the next time anybody says this to you, you are allowed to laugh. It's just crazy. If we were to prioritize necessities, so food and housing and going to the dentist more than once every 20 years, fair and rational planning would dictate against market forces. In fact, lots of stuff that's really profitable would have to be stopped. Great example, there's plenty of land in India right now. Lots of hungry people in India. Lots of land is growing things like tulips and dog food to send to Europe. Okay, very profitable. Way more profitable than growing food for hungry people. They don't have any money. By definition, you make more money selling tulips to Europe. If you cared about human rights and human needs, you'd have to stop the tulips going to Europe, redistribute the land, and let the hungry people have their own food, right? So this is why capitalism is a serious problem. Now, if we all had the ability to make equal demands, the market might distribute things a little more equally, but we don't, because there's vast economic disparity in the world, and capitalism only increases that disparity. Well, doesn't the profit motive maximize efficiency? You're going to hear this all the time, right? Well, yes, if by efficiency you mean simply maximizing profit by minimizing the cost. No, if efficiency means actually providing for human needs. So a couple statistics, 22,000 children every day die from poverty, and 1.4 million from lack of clean water, something so simple. So again, there's no money in this, so the resources don't get directed to it. Well, that was capitalism. On to patriarchy. I thought you might need a laugh about now. So as Mary Daly pointed out, I think in 1978, patriarchy is the ruling religion of the planet. And I feel like Kathy Barry pretty well covered this one this morning, so I could skip 3 pages. Patriarchy takes human beings who are biologically male and creates a class of people called men. So men are made by socialization to this thing called masculinity, and that's that process that turns a child into a boy and eventually into a man. And that requires a certain psychology. Masculinity, the psychology requires 3 things: entitlement, emotional numbness, and a dichotomy of self and other. And of course, that first despised other is always girls. So the worst thing you can call a boy is some version of girl, often a piece of, female anatomy warped into hate speech. We all know the words that they use. But once that process is in place and that category, icky female, has been created in their brains, you can then substitute that in a hierarchical society. Any group that needs to be subordinated can fill in for female. And masculinity, of course, is essential to any militarized culture. That's the psychology necessary in soldiers. You're only going to kill on command if that human impulse to care has been subdued or suppressed, and that psychological process of othering is firmly entrenched. Now, central to masculinity is a violation imperative. Men become real men by breaking boundaries. And for that entitled psyche, the only reason that no exists is because it's a sexual thrill to force past it. That is the real brilliance of patriarchy. It doesn't just naturalize oppression, it sexualizes acts of oppression. Okay? So it eroticizes domination and subordination, and then it takes that eroticized domination and subordination, and it institutionalizes that into masculinity and femininity. So it naturalizes, it eroticizes, and then it institutionalizes. And that's really good. The brilliance of feminism is that we figured that out. So femininity, well, that's just a set of behaviors that are in essence ritualized submission. So female socialization is a process of psychologically constraining and ultimately breaking girls. And that process is called grooming. And that creates a class of compliant victims. So across history, those practices have included things like foot binding and female genital mutilation, and of course the ever popular childhood sexual abuse. Femininity is really just the traumatized psyche displaying acquiescence. Now, this is not natural. It was not created by God. It is a corrupt and brutal social arrangement. It's become popular in some activist circles to embrace notions from postmodernism, and that includes this idea that gender is somehow a binary. Gender is not a binary. It is a hierarchy.
Right.
It's global in its reach, it's sadistic in its practice, and it is murderous in its conclusion, just like race and just like class. Gender demarcates the geopolitical boundaries of patriarchy, which is to say, it divides us in half. That half is not horizontal, it's vertical. And in case you missed this part, men are always on top. Gender is not some cosmic yin-yang, it's a fist and the flesh that bruises, right? It's a mouth crushed shut and a little girl who will never be the same. Gender is who gets to be human and who gets hurt. And that has to be made very clear because men know what they are capable of. They know. They know the sadism that they have built into their sex. So what they say to each other is, do it to her. Not to me, the human being, to her, the object, the thing. So they have to make it very clear, both visually and ideologically, who she is. So see, there she is, unable to walk. Or there she is on display. Or there she is, covered and secluded for your eyes only. And how much easier if he can say, God made her this way to lie beneath me. Or if he can say, nature made her this way, the thing with the hole. Or if he can say, she made herself this way, the slut who asked for it, because we always ask for it, right? The rape, the battering, the poverty, the prostitution, even the murder, we ask for it. Now, all of those practices in aggregate, those were what Andrea Dworkin named the barricade of sexual terrorism. And gender is what demarcates that boundary, very exactly. And this is really simple, people. Barricade, women live inside the barricade of sexual terrorism. Men live outside the barricade of sexual terrorism. In fact, men build that barricade fist by fist and fuck by fuck. It's exactly those violent, violating practices that construct a class of people called women. That is what men do to break us and to keep us broken. And that's what gender is, the breaking and the broken. Now, Noel Ignatieff, he wrote a book called How the Irish Became White, which is very instructive. But he's argued for abolishing the white race, which he defines as white privilege and race identity. Along the same lines, I'm going to argue that the sex class men is simply male privilege and gender identity, and it needs to be abolished if women are ever to be free. We don't have a choice. If you were born female, you were born on a battlefield. You're going to be punished for just saying that out loud, but the grim truth is, you're going to be punished anyway for the sin of being female. Right now, battering is the most commonly committed violent crime in the United States. It's a man beating up a woman. Men do that every 18 seconds. Globally, half of all women will experience life-threatening violence from a man. Half. That is more hatred than I can comprehend. That battlefield now is such a slaughter that we can't even collect our wounded. So, this is where all three of those systems, civilization, capitalism, patriarchy, this is where they merge, in that masculine violation imperative. That imperative includes breaking the sexual boundaries of women and girls. It involves breaking the cultural and political boundaries of indigenous people. I think the word is genocide. It involves breaking the biological boundaries of rivers and forests. And I want you to see that these two pictures are basically the same. Okay, you've got the people who live in their forest, who love their forest, and what happens to them, and then you've got the people who destroy the forest, right? It involves breaking the genetic boundaries of other species, so coming to a river near you, transgenic salmon, and ultimately the physical boundaries of the atom itself. Now you put all this together, the entire culture is sociopathic. The entitlement, the sadism, that endless lust to dominate. You'll never reach the end of it. What we are reaching is complete biotic collapse, starting with the least of us. The plankton populations are now collapsing. And it's because the oceans are too acidic from all the carbon. There's only so much that can sink into the ocean. And what that means, I know that plankton are probably a little too small and a little too green for most people to even know about, let alone really care about. But you should know that 2 out of 3 animal breaths are only made possible by the oxygen that plankton produce. So if the oceans go down, we go down with them. So what do? Well, we fight like hell. So you've heard of speed dating. Now you're going to get speed revolution. There's a few concepts that you might find helpful as we organize a serious resistance movement to whatever form of patriarchy you decide to take on. Okay, so liberals and radicals. Liberals believe that society is made up of individuals, and individualism is in fact so sacrosanct to liberals that being identified as a member of a group or a class, that's what they see as the harm. So being identified as a member of a group, that's an insult. For radicals, it's totally different. Society is made up of classes to radicals, and in Marx's original version, that was of course economic class, but really any group or caste. And it's made up of groups of people, and some of those groups have power over other groups. Okay, this is a hierarchy. So being a member of a group is not an insult, far from it. Identifying with that group is a first step toward breaking, your slave consciousness, and ultimately joining forces with people who share your condition to form an effective resistance movement. So you make common cause with people who share your condition. So that's one big difference between the liberals and the radicals. Another big difference. The nature of social reality. For liberals, they believe in a thing called idealism. So social reality is made up of ideas, attitudes, ideas. So it's a mental construct of some sort. And so for them, social change happens through rational argument, through education, through changing people's minds. Radicals, totally different. Radicalism is always materialist. So that means that society is made up of concrete material institutions, so systems of power, not by thoughts and ideas. So for radicals, the solution to oppression is to take those systems apart brick by brick. You have to make material change. So the liberals say we have to educate, and the radicals will say, well, yes, education is part of that program, but eventually we have to actually stop them. So if you remove power from the equation, liberalism makes oppression look voluntary, and it erases the fact that it's social subordination. So people withstand oppression using 3 psychological methods: denial, accommodation, and consent. So here's Harriet Tubman. I could have freed hundreds more if they had but known they were slaves. So that's the denial, the accommodation, and ultimately the consent. So this is the realization to which radicalism will ultimately bring you. And these are two of my favorite people from history. Here's my Christabel. We know that relying solely on arguments, we wandered for 40 years politically in the wilderness. And we were essentially begging men to listen to them. We know that arguments are not enough and that political force is necessary. Frederick Douglass, who well knew, as an escaped enslaved person, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Social change requires force. Okay? Now don't misunderstand me. Force is not the same as violence. Okay? Whether to wage your struggle using violent or nonviolent tactics, that's a decision that comes much later. I actually have a lot of respect for nonviolence. I mean, when understood and used properly, it's an extremely elegant technique. So this is not about violence and nonviolence. It's only to recognize that power is not a mistake, it's not a misunderstanding, it's not a disagreement. So justice is not won by rational argument, by personal, some kind of personal transformation, or by spiritual epiphany. It's won by taking power away from the people in power and redistributing that power across society, and giving the dispossessed what they need. Okay, so there are three broad categories of response to the situation of oppression. So the first is legal remedies to redress specific harms. What's interesting about all three of these categories actually is that all of them can be liberal or radical. And that's an important thing to remember. Because I think often we fall into these dichotomies of, well, some actions are liberal and some are radical. And it's not really that simple. I mean, I think that the ultimate goal is really what describes whether something's liberal or radical, not which of these responses you choose to use in your activism. Okay, so the legal response. Most activist groups generally are organized around legal responses. And that's for a very simple reason. As Catherine McKinnon says, law organizes power. So it's one of the most direct ways to reorganize power. The trick is to do that as radicals. So we have to ask the question, does this initiative actually redistribute power? Or does it just change who's at the top of the pyramid? I remember when I was 18 taking a women's studies class, and somebody asked, well, how will we know when feminism has reached its goal? And the professor said, when half the CEOs are women. Actually, my mouth about hit the floor. I didn't realize you could be a liberal and a feminist. It just didn't make any sense to me. I thought all feminists had to be radical, because I read Andrew Dworkin and Mary Daly, and I was like all set. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So does this initiative redefine power, not just who's at the top of the hierarchy? Does it take away the rights of the oppressors and reestablish the rights of the dispossessed? Does it let people control the material conditions of their lives? That's what we're after. Number two would be direct action. So some people bypass, they sort of jump over or decide not to go the legal route, and they go right to direct action. And there's lots of examples of this through history. The Montgomery bus boycott is a perfect example. They used their economic power. They didn't use the court system to desegregate the Montgomery bus system. Your basic insurrection would be another example. So obviously direct action covers an awful lot of ground. As with legal remedies, though, the goal of direct action can be either liberal or radical, or downright revolutionary. The third category is withdrawal. Now, the main difference between withdrawal as a successful strategy and withdrawal as a failed strategy is whether that withdrawal is seen as adequate in itself, or if the withdrawal is linked specifically to political resistance. Now that difference hinges exactly on that distinction between liberal and radical. Issues of identification, of loyalty to your own, of class consciousness, absolutely crucial to resistance movements. That may in fact be our hardest job as radicals, is breaking through that psychology of the oppressed. But alone it's not enough. The withdrawal has got to go beyond the intellectual, the emotional, the psychological. It's got to include a goal of actually winning justice. Withdrawal may give solace, but ultimately it will change nothing. And living in a rarefied world of the already converted will not save women or this planet. So Gene Sharp is somebody who I think we should know his work pretty thoroughly if we actually intend to build a serious resistance movement. I think he's really phenomenal. He's probably responsible for more revolutions than anybody who's ever lived. Maybe Karl Marx, but one or the other would be my two picks. And this is a great quote from Gene Sharp. Now, the people that he calls utopians, I would call withdrawalists, but it's the same idea. Utopians are often especially sensitive to the evils of the world, and they crave certainty, purity, completeness, firmly reject the evil as totally as possible, wishing to avoid any compromise with them. They await a new world, which is to come into being by an act of God, a change in the human spirit, by autonomous changes in economic conditions, or by a deep, spontaneous social upheaval, all beyond deliberate human control. The most serious weakness of this response, or the problem of this world, is not the broad vision or the commitment of the people who believe in it. The weakness is that these believers have no effective way to reach the society of their dreams. I would say that sums up my youth. I've heard the phrase secular millennialism, and that's what he's getting at. We just sort of thought that somehow it would happen. We had no plan. Okay, so a few myths about resistance. Now, most of these myths are peculiarly American. I think there's two reasons for that. One is that, historically speaking, we haven't had a real left in this country really since the 30s. So none of us were really trained to think in political terms. We're sort of stabbing around in the dark here. Also because there's been a triumph of individualism, and that's because individualism really bolsters corporate capitalism. So of course that's gotten, a lot of help from the bad people. So anyway, so these are some of the myths that I think a lot of us fall into, simply because we don't know better. So myth number one, resistance movements just happen. I'm going to beg you to please read some history. Resistance movements don't just happen. There are, in fact, entire volumes about strategy written for resistance movements. Movements take untold hours of organizing across lifetimes of people, usually across generations. There is nothing spontaneous about the process. It takes tremendous dedication, it takes strategic smarts, tons of courage. Believing that resistance will magically happen condemns us to the sidelines, waiting for this great glorious revolution that will in fact never come. Social change happens through personal example. If I live a pure and righteous life, that will inspire others. Any strategy based on individual change is doomed to fail, because social subordination is not an individual condition. It's a group condition, a class condition. It will only change through group effort. But this is where you get all this emphasis on things like, your lifestyle, your consumer choices, and on things like your personal carbon footprint. And am I the only one who's noticed that when you're talking about carbon footprint, that is the only time that men try to prove they're smaller. Right? So let's talk about example as a political strategy. Now, by their nature, agricultural societies are imperialist because they're based on drawdown. Hopefully we got that covered. But civilizations follow that same pattern. They conquer the region. And over for 10,000 years, that's been what's happened. They have invaded the territory of neighboring indigenous people and done their best to take what they want. Now, some of those indigenous people embody the values that everyone in this room holds dear. They're egalitarian, they're sustainable, they're peaceful, they're matrilineal cultures. And in all that time, over all those invasions, the face-to-face example of an egalitarian, peaceful society has never once changed the invaders. It has never once brought on an epiphany in the invading culture, never once in 10,000 years. The dominant culture will not change because it sees the beautiful nonviolent values that we behold in our hearts. And it's not going to change because it sees our life-affirming free-range compost piles. Sorry, but history is literally the story of that dominating culture coming into contact with sustainable egalitarian cultures and simply wiping them out. There are no exceptions. So personal example is